Okay, so we are getting started. This is gonna be our first thing with micro, and in reality, the first part of micro is a lot of what we did to start our entire class off in the beginning. Anyway, um, with the just regular supply and demand shifters. I'm gonna stress you right now that when it comes to micro, the big shifter that you really, really have to have down pat is substitutes and complements and normal inferior goods. You need to be able to look at that and just hit it out of the park every single time. So we're gonna do a lot of practice with that. But really, I mean, so this course used to be split up in two in the sense that you'd take macro first half of the year, and then be a whole new class that you could register for in the second half of the year with micro. Now we've combined that, or they combined that in previous years, because the first part of micro is the first part of macro. It's just understanding what supply and demand is. So what I have drawn here is just a simple supply and demand curve, right? With demand sloping down, supply sloping up, and we have our equilibrium, right, at $500 for, and there'd be 5,000 whatever bought. I kind of put this as, let's call this the iPhone, right? This is the market for iPhone. All right, so remember, at whatever the market equilibrium, that's where we're always operating at, as long as there's no government impositions. And we're going to talk a bit about price ceilings, price floors, and quotas, right? So it's all kind of coming back to this start. Now, what we're going to talk about to start here, though, is just a little bit of a new concept that we can add with this, all right? And what we're going to call this is consumer and producer surplus, which gets us total surplus and what the welfare to society is, all right? So let me show you how this works. All right, so if this is our graph, right, and we know that our equilibrium is at $500, and at that equilibrium, 5,000 iPhones will be sold, right? This is productively efficient. This is allocatively efficient, right? But there's another thing that comes into this, right? And what you have to realize is that this demand curve represents all types of different buyers, right? So for instance, right at the top here, this is somebody who would have bought that iPhone for $1,000, right? That's how much they value it at. Now, they bought it for $500. So if you think about this person, they were willing to spend $1,000, but they bought it for $500. You could think about that person as saving basically $500, right? And then as you go down, right, say somebody would have bought it for $950, they got it for $500, right? What we're seeing here is that these are all individuals who value the iPhone at greater than $500, but they bought it for $500. So what they're doing here is saving a lot of money, right, in their minds. Right? And what I just did is from each demand curve down to the market equilibrium price, right, drawing a line. This person would have bought it for $900, boom, got it for $500. Right? This person would have bought it for $700, but got it for $500. This triangle that kind of comes out of that, this is what we call consumer surplus. And all that means is that that's how much money different consumers, when you add it all together, kind of saved, or in their mind saved, because they valued that good at a price that is a lot larger than what they actually bought it for, right? This person would have spent $1,000, but they bought it for $500. That's a surplus. That's a savings for that individual of $500. Now, as you move along this demand curve all the way down, these people, right? So this person values that iPhone at $400, so they're not going to buy it for $500, right? So this part of the demand curve, these people aren't buying that iPhone because they don't value it at that the price that it's currently at. All right, so we get this consumer surplus idea, right? Going down from the demand curve right down to your equilibrium price. And now we can do this the opposite way as well. This supply curve, these are all the producers of the iPhone, right? Think about this supply curve as every single producer, right? We just add them all up, right? So this producer would have sold that iPhone for what, like $50, right? But they sold it for 500, right? This producer would have sold it for 100. They got it. They sold it for 500, right? So now what we get is all these different producers who, based on, and why are they selling it for, or would have sold it for lower? Well, because they made it cheaper or whatever it might be, right? And what we get happening here is, right, this producer would have sold it for 200, sold it for 500. They have a surplus, or they saved or made an extra $300, right? This producer would have sold it for 400, sold it for 500. They have a surplus of 100, right? And so what we get here, this is producer surplus, right? And now these right here, this part of the supply curve, these are all producers who wanted to sell it above 500, right? But the people but they're not going to be able to, because the market equilibrium is 500, right? So these are all producers who are unable to sell the good, just like these are all consumers who will not buy the good, right? And that's why we get this part, right? And so what ends up happening here is that when you add consumer surplus, so consumer surplus plus producer surplus, right, that's going to equal our total surplus, all right, or welfare to society. And they will ask you to calculate this. So how do you calculate it? Well, we got what? 2 triangles there, one big triangle. So if you ask how you calculate consumer surplus, right, is it base, 1/2 base times height, right? And there you go. So 1/2, what, a base of, we'll call it just 5, right? And another, what, 500 times 5, 1/2, do that math, right? And here you go. So 1/2 base times height, and same thing over here, 1/2 base times height. And we can also do the same thing for total surplus, just that area of the triangle. All right, so that's really this first part. And what this shows us, really, the key here is that what you see is that this entire triangle is filled with consumer and producer surplus. This is maximizing the welfare of society. And that shows when you let the market be where it wants to be at this equilibrium price, right, then you are maximizing welfare to society. That's 2 things. That's productively efficient, that's allocatively efficient, all right? All that kind of goes into it, right? So think about it. There are goods right now, right, that you might say like, oh man, I would have paid so much more for it, but I got it at this. That kind of thinking, that's consumer surplus. And producers think the same way. Oh wow, I would have sold that good a lot cheaper, but I was able to sell it at this price because of the market. That's producer surplus. All right. Now, what I mean by this maximizes welfare is you can look at different ways. If I take the same graph of how, let's put now, this is my same graph, right, with our iPhones, right? And what we could do here is, well, we have a couple things that government can do, right, to manipulate the price, right? We talked about 3, right? So let's do them. 1, you have a price floor, right? Price floors, remember, to be effective, price floors go above the equilibrium price, right? So let's put a price floor at, say, $800. I'll draw that right across. 800. All right. Now, at $800, we would find that, let's say here, remember what we do when we do price floors or price ceilings or quotas, anything, right? We go where it hits our demand curve, right? First curve that hits, and we would draw it down, right? And we'll say that only 2,000 people would have bought it or will buy it at that 800. Right over here, Now, obviously, suppliers are willing to pay for or willing to sell it more, right? We'll say like 8,000 are supplied, right? But only 2,000 are bought, right? So we would say that this area, right, that would be a surplus, right? Because more is offered than bought. But let's go back to our original idea. So here's our price floor at $800. Only 2,000 are bought, okay? So let's think about this consumer and producer surplus idea. Right? And this is the steps that you do. Go from the demand curve down to the price that you pay for it, right? So this person who would have bought it for 1,000, they're getting it for 800, right? And we keep doing that on our demand curve, right? And now all the way to where the price is paid, and this is consumer surplus, right? Now think about this line, right, as being a boundary, and let's do it for the same thing with producer surplus. All right, so we go from our supply curve all the way up to the price that's paid. All the way up here. Right, and there is your producer surplus, right? Now, you can't go over this way, right? This is not an option because only 2,000 people bought it, right? We're stopping right at that boundary line. So what happens here? Well, now you get this triangle. If we go back to our original here, you see that entire thing was filled. Now when we take that away, right, consumer surplus shrank, right? It goes, all that red part becomes smaller. Producer surplus gains. So price floors are put into place for producers, right? To set a minimum price, it would only help producers. Now, what we're left with when we do that, get a different color here. This triangle, now we can see this happening here. This triangle represents what society lost, right? This was all in our previous graph. This was consumer surplus that was had, and this was producer surplus that was had, and now it's gone. And what we call this is dead weight loss, right? That is the loss to society because of government imposition, right? Or some kind of program that's put in place. You think about, like, this could be the minimum wage, right, is a price floor that we talk about. Ceiling would be the same way, right, for like rent or whatever it might be. The ones that we talked about, so ceiling, same idea. We put it below though, right, and we get how many people would supply it. We get this shortage that would happen, and we draw the same thing. But when we get this, we always get that dead weight loss, and it occurs right at that triangle because that consumer surplus and producer surplus that was had when we just let free markets do what they do is now gone because we have dead weight loss. All right. Now the second one, right? So we could do a ceiling, but let's switch ideas here and let's do a quota, right? Because in the quota we get a little bit different idea. All right. So let's say the government sets a quota at 3,000, right? That's as much iPhones that can be sold. All right, they find that iPhones cause cancer, so they're gonna limit them, right? All right, there you go, iPhone 3,000. Now, if you remember with the quota, what do? Well, we always, in every single case, with any ceiling floor, we go and we find where it hits our curve. So this is where it hits the supply curve. All right, and we'll say that hits it at, call this $300. Then we find where it hits our demand curve, and we'll say this hits it $700. Right? And we get all these kind of different like shapes taken into place. Now, if you remember, we called this from 300 to 700 the quota rent, right? That is the money that the government would take in basically taxes, right? That if you were a supplier of iPhones, you'd have to pay the government that difference, right? So the consumer pays $700, the producer gets $300, the The $400 that's in between, that goes to the government, right? So what can we do here? Well, let's do the same thing. We go consumer and producer surplus, all right? So this is the amount that's paid by consumers. So this person would have paid more than that, right? So here we go, demand curve down to price paid. And that's consumer surplus, right? And then supply curve up to where the price that suppliers get, which is 300, and we stop right there. And that's producer surplus. And then we get this triangle that forms over here of consumer and producer surplus that could have been had. And that's deadweight loss. Right, and then we're left with that big square in the middle. And it's not necessarily deadweight loss because somebody gets it. And who gets it? Well, that's the government's money. Right, so this is the area of basically how much the government made in tax or whatever you want to call it, right? Quota rent, right? That area from that area of a square, right? So you can find all of these and you will be asked to find them. How much is consumer surplus if they give you numbers? How much is producer surplus if they give you numbers? How much is the deadweight loss? How much did government collect? And you can do that for all of those just by finding areas of triangles, areas of squares, right? Nothing too difficult there. Even I can do it, all right? You're not going to have to find any areas of trapezoids or anything like that, all right? But that is your first idea. We're just taking that consumer, or we're just taking supply and demand. We're just adding a little bit more to it. Consumer surplus, producer surplus, total surplus, right? And then deadweight loss. Basic idea is that when markets are allowed to operate where they want, or at the equilibrium, you maximize the welfare of society. And we can see that by this entire area given to either consumers or producers. When the government gets involved, we can show how we have deadweight loss, how it's inefficient, right? That deadweight loss shows that inefficiency, right? Less consumer surplus here, more producer surplus, but a whole lot lost in that triangle. And same thing goes when I go to our quota, right? This deadweight loss shows inefficiency, right? In all of these, same thing, nothing's happening over here. These are suppliers and consumers who do not operate in the market because they do not want to sell it at some price or buy it at one price, all right? So that's our first little wrinkle into microeconomics.